Bitter winds don't just kill, they erase. On a terrifyingly warm morning in 1888, the Dakota skies turned pitch black, dropping temperatures by 40 degrees in mere minutes. Children were trapped in flimsy wooden schoolhouses, clad only in light sweaters. Thousands froze in their tracks, lost mere yards from their own front doors. Yet, in one desolate valley, 70 souls survived the deadliest whiteout in American history. They owed their lives to a paranoid outcast and the very underground dirt bunker his neighbors had brutally mocked as a mud-soaked grave. This is the harrowing true story of the Schoolhouse blizzard. Josiah Harding did not look at the sky with the same hopeful reverence as the other homesteaders in the Dakota Territory. While his neighbors prayed for rain and celebrated the golden summer sun, Josiah watched the horizon with the wary, unflinching gaze of a man expecting an ambush. He knew a fundamental truth about the prairie that the newcomers from the east had yet to learn. The open plains did not love them, and the wind was always waiting to strip the flesh from their bones. Josiah had learned this lesson 5 years earlier during a sudden localized squall that had caught his wife Emmeline between the barn and their original hastily built cabin. It was a distance of only 40 yards. When Josiah finally dug her out the next morning, her fingers were locked into the frozen earth, pointing blindly toward a front door she could not see. Since that day, Josiah spoke little. Instead, he dug. While other settlers like the prosperous and boisterous Thaddeus Boone spent their money importing pine lumber from Chicago to build handsome 2-story clapboard houses, Josiah retreated into the earth. He staked out a plot on a slight rise near the center of the valley and began constructing what the locals would soon cruelly dub Harding's Grave. It was a sod house, but not the simple temporary shelters built by fresh immigrants. Josiah's construction was a fortress of dirt root and paranoia. He excavated 5 feet down into the hard-pan clay, creating a subterranean living space. The walls extending above ground were constructed from Nebraska marble, dense interlocking bricks of prairie turf cut 3 feet thick. He layered the sod with staggered joints like a master mason working with granite. The roof was a marvel of over-engineering a lattice of thick cedar poles he had dragged for 40 miles, covered in a foot of packed clay topped with another layer of living sod to bind it together against the gales. There were no windows on the north or west walls. The door facing south was heavy oak, salvaged from a wrecked freight wagon recessed deep into the earthen frame to prevent the wind from prying it open. Inside, the air was perpetually cool, smelling heavily of damp loam and wood smoke. It was dark, claustrophobic, and undeniably ugly. Thaddeus Boone, whose elegant white house stood proudly just a mile down the wagon trail, never missed an opportunity to mock the structure. You building a house or digging a tomb? Harding. Thaddeus had called out from his buggy one crisp autumn afternoon, his young son Jeremiah sitting beside him. If you bury yourself before you're dead, you save the undertaker a trip, I suppose. Josiah had merely leaned on his spade, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes locking onto Thaddeus's imported wool coat. Wood splinters, Boone, Josiah had replied, his voice rough from disuse. Dirt endures. The mockery spread. Soon, the entire valley whispered about the madman in his grave. They laughed when they saw Josiah stockpiling mountains of dried buffalo chips and tons of Pennsylvania coal, far more than one man could burn in 3 winters. They laughed harder when they noticed the thick braided hemp ropes Josiah had strung up. He had run guide ropes from his heavy oak door to his barn to his well, and most inexplicably, a long line stretching out toward the property boundary, stopping just 50 yards short of the new valley schoolhouse. To the town, Josiah was a broken man driven mad by grief, preparing for an apocalypse that would never come. But Josiah didn't care about their laughter. He cared about the barometer resting on his heavy wooden table, and he cared about the wind. He knew the sky was a liar. And on January 12th, 1888, the sky was about to tell the greatest lie in American history. The morning of January 12th broke with a miraculous, almost intoxicating sweetness. For weeks, the Dakota Territory had been locked in a deep, miserable freeze. The snowpack was heavy, and the settlers had spent their holidays huddled around coal stoves, fighting back frostbite. But on this Thursday, the sun rose brilliantly, and a warm southern breeze swept across the plains. By 9 in the morning, the temperature had surged into the upper 40s. The snow began to melt, turning the wagon ruts into muddy streams. Icicles that had clung stubbornly to eaves for a month began to weep, dropping with hollow musical plinks into the puddles below. It felt exactly like a sudden glorious arrival of April. In the valley, doors flung open. Children burst from their homes, shedding the heavy, restrictive woolen coat scarves and mittens that had imprisoned them all winter. Men rolled up their sleeves to chop wood. Women hung laundry out on the lines to catch the fresh breeze. Down the road from Josiah's fortress, the one-room schoolhouse was buzzing with energy. Eleanor Whitman, a 22-year-old teacher who had arrived from Boston only 6 months prior, opened the schoolhouse windows to let out the stuffy smell of damp wool and chalk dust. Eleanor was a bright, optimistic woman who had struggled with the brutal isolation of the prairie winter. Today, the warm breeze kissing her face felt like salvation. "All right, class, settle down," Eleanor called out, clapping her hands. Before her sat 34 children ranging from 6 to 16. Among them was young Jeremiah Boone, sitting near the front, his heavy winter coat left abandoned on the porch of his father's grand clapboard house. Next to him sat Lucy O'Donnell, a frail girl of 8, wearing only a light cotton dress and a knitted cardigan. "Because the weather is so lovely," Eleanor announced. "If we can finish our arithmetic by noon, we will take our lunch outside in the sunshine." The room erupted into cheers. But less than a mile away, Josiah Harding was not cheering. He stood outside his heavy oak door, his boots sinking into the thawing mud, staring at the southern horizon. The air was warm, yes, but it felt heavy. Dead. The usual rustle of the dormant prairie grass was entirely absent. The silence was absolute. Josiah walked slowly into his sod bunker and approached the table. His barometer, an expensive brass instrument he had traded 2 good horses for, was acting erratically. The needle wasn't just dropping, it was plummeting. The atmospheric pressure was crashing at a rate Josiah had never seen in his lifetime. He turned and looked at his dog, a grizzled shepherd mix named Barnaby. Barnaby wasn't sleeping in his usual spot by the stove. The dog was wedged under Josiah's bed, shivering uncontrollably, letting out low, anxious whines. Josiah walked out to the barn. His 2 draft horses were frantic, stamping their hooves violently and rolling their eyes, their coats slick with nervous sweat. The animals could feel the earth holding its breath. Josiah stepped back outside. He looked north. At first, it looked like a mountain range had suddenly erupted from the flat plains. A solid wall of deep bruised purple and ash black was rising on the horizon. It stretched as far as the eye could see east to west. But it wasn't clouds. It was a tidal wave of pulverized ice driven by cyclonic winds. The cold front dropping down from Canada was colliding with the unseasonable warm, moist air from the Gulf, creating an explosive atmospheric detonation. As Josiah watched the warm breeze abruptly died, a sudden terrifying vacuum took its place. Then he heard it. It sounded like 100 freight trains tearing across the prairie simultaneously, a deep guttural roar that seemed to vibrate up through the soles of his boots. The black wall was moving with terrifying speed, devouring the miles, blotting out the sun. "God Almighty," Josiah whispered. He didn't run. Panic was for the unprepared. He turned calmly, walked into his dark subterranean home, and began hauling massive buckets of coal toward the stove. He checked the seal on his heavy door. He tested the tension on his guide ropes. He was ready. But as he latched his windowless door, a horrifying thought struck him. The schoolhouse. He looked at his pocket watch. It was 11:15 a.m. The children were there, in a building made of single-pane glass and half-inch pine boards. Outside, the roar became deafening. The sun vanished, swallowed by a darkness absolute and total. The temperature outside Josiah's door dropped from 45 degrees to 5 degrees below zero in less than 3 minutes. The white monster had arrived. Inside the schoolhouse, the shift happened so fast it defied comprehension. Eleanor Whitman was in the middle of writing a fraction on the chalkboard when the building shuddered violently as if it had been struck by a physical blow. The windows facing north exploded inward, spraying the classroom with glass shards and a blinding torrent of white. "Get down!" Eleanor screamed, dropping her chalk and rushing toward the children. The warm spring air in the room was instantly replaced by a paralyzing, suffocating cold. The wind shrieked through the broken windows with a high-pitched mechanical whine. The blizzard did not bring soft falling snowflakes. It brought fine sand-like crystals of ice that blasted into the room horizontally, cutting into exposed skin like ground glass. Chaos erupted. Children shrieked, scrambling under their desks. Desks flipped over as the wind caught them. The iron coal stove in the center of the room flared violently as the wind blew back down the chimney pipe, vomiting a cloud of choking black smoke into the room before the fire was snuffed out entirely by the invasive cold. Eleanor fought her way through the gale, grabbing a heavy wool blanket from her desk chair, and tried to nail it over the broken window. The wind tore the blanket from her hands, instantly sucking it out into the howling void. She looked out the shattered frame. There was no sky. There was no ground. There was only a furious, blinding white kinetic energy. She couldn't see her own hand stretched out past the window frame. "Teacher, teacher, I'm cold y dull." Little Lucy O'Donnell cried out from the floor, her lips already turning a faint shade of blue. Eleanor grabbed the shivering children, herding them away from the windward wall, piling them into the center of the room. "Everyone huddle together. Keep your heads down," she shouted, though she could barely hear her own voice over the roaring wind. She looked up at the ceiling. The pine boards were groaning, bowing under the immense pressure of the wind and the rapidly accumulating ice. The building wasn't just freezing, it was losing structural integrity. The temperature inside the room had plunged below zero. The ink in the inkwells on the desks had already frozen solid, cracking the glass jars. Eleanor looked at Jeremiah Boone. The boy was trembling violently, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "My pa," he chattered. "My pa's gonna come get us. He's got the sleigh." Eleanor bit her lip, suppressing a sob. No one was coming. To step into that whiteout was suicide. A man would lose his bearings in 3 steps and freeze to death in 10 minutes. They were trapped in a wooden box that was rapidly becoming an ice box. If the roof didn't cave in, the cold would claim them all before nightfall. A mile away, Thaddeus Boone was not coming with a sleigh. He had been halfway to town when the storm hit. Blinded and freezing in his light jacket, Thaddeus had unhitched his horse in a panic, trying to ride bareback only to be thrown into a snowdrift. He was currently crawling on his hands and knees, weeping hopelessly, lost in his own cornfield, screaming for a God he suddenly believed in to save him. In his sod fortress, Josiah Harding sat by his roaring coal stove. The thick earthen walls absorbed the monstrous howling outside, reducing it to a dull, heavy vibration. It was 65 degrees in his subterranean home. The air was calm. He was perfectly safe. He poured himself a cup of black coffee from the tin pot on the stove. He raised it to his lips. He paused. He stared at the heavy oak door. He imagined the flimsy pine walls of the schoolhouse. He imagined the single-pane windows. He remembered Emmeline's frozen fingers gripping the frozen earth. Josiah slammed the tin cup down on the table, spilling the scalding coffee. "Damn it!" he hissed to the empty room. He didn't want to go. Every survival instinct forged over years of prairie life screamed at him to stay put, to lock the door and let the weak perish as nature intended. But Josiah was not a monster. He was just a man who had built a wall against the world. And right now, the world needed to get behind his wall. Josiah moved with frantic precision. He strapped on a heavy buffalo hide coat, thick leather chaps, and wrapped his face in 3 layers of wool scarves, leaving only a narrow slit for his eyes. He grabbed a coil of 1/2-inch nautical rope from the corner, 200 feet of it. He tied one end securely around his waist with a bowline knot. He walked to the door, took a deep breath, and unlatched the heavy iron bolt. The moment he pulled the door open, the storm attacked him. The wind hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking him back a step. The air was so dense with pulverized ice that breathing through his nose was impossible. He had to breathe into the wool scarf to keep his lungs from freezing. He stepped out, leaning forward at a 45-degree angle, just to remain standing. He found his thick guide rope attached to the door frame. He gripped it with heavy leather mittens. He began to walk, hand over hand, blind. The roar was absolute, drowning out his own thoughts. The cold gnawed at his extremities with razor teeth. He reached the end of the first rope, the one leading toward the property line. He tied the fresh coil around the post, securing his lifeline. He knew the schoolhouse was exactly 150 paces south-southeast from this post. If he drifted even 5 degrees off course, he would miss the building entirely, reach the end of his rope, and freeze to death in the open. Josiah stepped off the property line, abandoning the safety of his established ropes. He was walking into the abyss now, entirely reliant on the rope paying out from his waist, and the internal compass built from years of surveying this exact patch of land. 1 he counted in his head. 2. 3. The wind tried to tear him sideways. Ice sealed his eyelashes shut. He had to constantly reach up with his clumsy mittens to break the ice so he could see even an inch in front of his face. 50. He was stumbling now. The snow was drifting rapidly already, waist-high in places. The physical exertion was immense, generating sweat under his heavy hide coat, which was the most dangerous thing that could happen. If he stopped moving, that sweat would freeze, turning his clothes into an icy tomb. 100. His lungs burned. His legs felt like lead columns. The rope around his waist was pulling taut, the wind catching the long line trailing behind him, creating massive drag. He felt an overwhelming urge to lie down just for a moment to rest his eyes. Emmeline, he thought, forcing his legs to push through the heavy drifts. Not again. Never again. 140. He should be close. He stopped and swung his arms blindly through the whiteout. Nothing. 145. He swept his arms again. He took another step. His boot caught on something hard and metallic beneath the snow. He fell forward, slamming his knee into an unseen object. He reached out with frozen fingers, feeling the shape. It was iron. It was the schoolhouse water pump. Josiah dragged himself to his feet. He took 3 more steps and collided hard with a flat wooden surface. He ran his hands along it, clapboard siding. He pounded on the wood with his heavy fists, screaming into the wind. "Open up, open up!" Inside, Eleanor Whitman had gathered the 34 children into a tight mass in the center of the room. The younger ones were crying softly, their tears freezing on their cheeks. The older ones were deathly silent. The temperature was plunging past 20 below zero. Eleanor had covered them with every coat and blanket they had, but it wasn't enough. The cold was a living thing creeping into their bones, slowing their hearts. Then, over the shrieking wind, Eleanor heard it. A rhythmic thudding against the southern wall. Thump, thump, thump. She forced herself up, her joints stiff and aching from the cold. She stumbled toward the heavy oak door of the schoolhouse. Her hands, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the latch. With a desperate heave, she pulled. The wind ripped the door open, tearing it from Eleanor's grasp and slamming it against the exterior wall. A massive, snow-covered figure stood in the doorway, looking like a beast carved from ice. The figure stepped inside, dragging a thick hemp rope behind him. He pushed the door shut against the howling gale and slid the bolt home. Josiah pulled the heavy scarves down from his face. Ice clung to his beard and eyebrows. He looked at the huddled, freezing mass of children, and then at the shivering teacher. "My name is Josiah Harding." He rasped, his voice barely a whisper through his raw throat. "I've come to take you to my grave." The interior of the schoolhouse was a tomb of freezing pine and shattered glass. Josiah Harding stood before the terrified children, a massive silhouette rimed in frost, holding the end of a frozen hemp rope. He didn't offer a gentle smile or words of false comfort. Survival in the Dakota Territory didn't care about comfort. It demanded strict, uncompromising obedience. "Listen to me, and listen fast!" Josiah's voice rumbled, cutting through the high-pitched shriek of the wind tearing through the broken windows. "Outside this door is a killer. It will blind you, it will freeze the breath in your throat, and if you let go of this rope, it will bury you. You will not cry out. You will not stop walking. If you drop the person behind you will walk over you." Eleanor Whitman gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, but Josiah shot her a fierce, grounding look. It was a harsh truth, but terror was a better motivator than hope right now. "Miss Whitman," Josiah commanded, handing her a heavy coil of the rope. "Tie this securely around your waist. You will bring up the rear." "Wyatt," Josiah barked, pointing a thick leather-clad finger at a sturdy 15-year-old boy cowering near the stove. "Wyatt Jensen, you're the oldest. You take point right behind me. You hold this rope with both hands. Do not let go, even if your fingers feel like they're burning." Josiah quickly organized the 34 children. He spaced them out along the rope-tying loops for the smaller ones to put their wrists through, ensuring they couldn't accidentally let go. Little Lucy O'Donnell, her lips a frightening shade of violet, was secured directly behind Wyatt, where the larger boy's body might break some of the wind. Jeremiah Boone, still weeping for his father, was tied near the middle. "Keep the line taut," Josiah instructed, pulling his thick wool scarves back over his face until only his eyes were visible. "If the line goes slack, we stop, but we do not stop for long. May God have mercy on us all." He unbolted the heavy door. The storm didn't just blow in, it violently invaded. The temperature in the room plummeted the final few degrees, snuffing out any lingering warmth. The roar was deafening, a mechanical, grinding howl that vibrated in their teeth. Josiah stepped out into the whiteout, leaning his massive weight against the gale. Wyatt followed, his eyes squeezed shut against the pulverized ice gripping the rope like a lifeline. One by one, the children filed out into the abyss. Eleanor Whitman was the last to exit, pulling the useless schoolhouse door shut behind her, plunging them completely into the storm's mercy. The journey was only 150 paces, but in the heart of the white monster, distance lost all meaning. The cold was absolute. It bit through their thin cotton dresses, their light sweaters, their denim trousers. It felt less like a temperature and more like a physical assault, thousands of tiny freezing needles driving into their skin. The wind, clocking in at over 60 miles per hour, hit them broadside. It wanted to tear the children from the rope, to scatter them across the prairie like dead leaves. 10 paces. Josiah forged ahead, a human icebreaker. He kept his left hand clamped on the guide rope leading back to his property, his right hand gripping the lifeline connecting him to the children. He moved with agonizing slowness, testing the snowdrifts, kicking paths through the rapidly accumulating powder so the smaller children wouldn't have to wade through waist-high snow. 40 paces. Behind him, chaos reigned in silence. The wind stole their voices. Wyatt Jensen was sobbing tears freezing instantly to his cheeks, but he marched on, dragging the line forward. In the middle of the pack, young Jeremiah Boone lost his footing. He slipped on a patch of black ice hidden beneath the snowdrift and fell hard, pulling the rope taut. The sudden yank halted the entire line. Josiah felt the resistance. He stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't see past Wyatt. "Up!" Josiah roared through the sound barely reached his own ears. He yanked the rope firmly, a tactile command traveling down the line. Jeremiah struggled in the snow, panic setting in as the cold rapidly sapped his energy. The boy felt an overwhelming narcotic urge to just lie there and sleep. But the girl behind him, a fiery 12-year-old named Clementine Hughes, grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and hauled him upward with adrenaline-fueled strength. Jeremiah found his feet. The line went slack. They moved again. 90 paces. Eleanor Whitman, anchoring the rear, felt her legs going numb. The heavy wool blanket she had draped over her shoulders was stiff with ice, acting like a sail that caught the wind, constantly threatening to pull her backward. She prayed with every step, her mind a repeating mantra of "please, please, please." 140 paces. Josiah hit the boundary post. He tied off the schoolhouse line, his thick leather mittens clumsy and stiff. He grabbed the main line leading to his heavy oak door. "Almost there," he bellowed, turning back to the white void. 5 minutes later, Josiah kicked the heavy oak door of his bunker open. He didn't wait. He grabbed Wyatt by the collar and hurled the boy inside. He began hauling the rope in hand over hand, dragging the frozen, stumbling children out of the storm and into the earth. They fell through the doorway like discarded dolls collapsing onto the packed dirt floor. Eleanor was the last to fall inside. Josiah slammed the heavy door shut, throwing the iron bolt. The sudden silence was shocking. The roar of the storm was instantly muted to a heavy, distant thudding against the thick sod walls and the roof. The air inside, heated by the massive pile of Pennsylvania coal Josiah had burning in the iron stove, was staggeringly warm. It smelled of damp earth sweat and roasting coffee. To the 35 freezing souls lying on the dirt floor, it smelled like heaven. Inside the subterranean fortress, absolute pandemonium slowly gave way to exhausted relief. Eleanor Whitman, ignoring her own frozen, aching fingers, immediately began crawling among the children. "Don't get too close to the stove," she warned sharply, her voice cracking. "Let yourselves thaw. Slowly rub your hands. Don't put them near the fire." Josiah stood by the door, shedding his ice-caked buffalo coat. He watched the children shivering violently on his floor. They were safe. The bunker was holding. His paranoia, mocked by the entire valley, had just saved 35 lives. He should have felt vindicated. He should have sat down in his heavy wooden chair and rested. Instead, he walked over to his heavy oak table and looked at the brass barometer. It hadn't risen. If anything, the atmospheric pressure was still dropping. The storm wasn't passing. It was settling in. Josiah looked at his pocket watch. It was 1:30 p.m. The sky outside was as black as midnight. He thought about the valley. He thought about the main wagon trail that ran just a quarter-mile east of his property line. "Mr. Harding," Eleanor said softly, approaching him. Her hair was wet from melting ice, and her face was flushed a violent red as blood rushed back to her skin. I don't know how to thank you. We would have died." Josiah didn't look at her. He was staring at his thick leather mittens resting on the table. "The afternoon stagecoach from Yankton," Josiah muttered, his voice gravelly. "It was due through the valley at noon." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You can't go back out there. It's suicide. You said so yourself." "I have the ropes," Josiah replied, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. "And I have the coal. If that coach got caught on the open trail—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew what happened to people caught in the open. Josiah moved with grim purpose. He took an extra coil of rope from the corner, 300 feet this time. He grabbed 2 heavy wool blankets and strapped them over his shoulders. He put the buffalo coat back on, wrapping the scarves tight around his face. "Lock this door behind me," Josiah commanded, looking at Wyatt Jensen, who was huddled near the stove. "Do not open it until you hear me knock 3 times. Do you understand?" Wyatt nodded, his eyes wide with fear and awe. Josiah stepped back into the nightmare. The wind had intensified, shifting slightly to the northwest, bringing with it an even more brutal biting cold. The temperature was nearing 30 below zero. He followed his guide rope back to the property line. From there, he tied off the new coil and struck out eastward toward the wagon trail. This was infinitely more dangerous than the walk to the schoolhouse. He had no precise pacing to rely on, no large structure to blindly bump into. He was walking into the open prairie, trusting his internal compass to hit a narrow dirt road buried under 3 feet of drifting snow. He walked for what felt like hours, the rope paying out steadily from his waist. His body screamed in protest. The cold was penetrating his thick coat, settling deep into his joints. 200 feet, 250. He stopped. The rope was nearly fully extended. He was close to his limit. If he didn't find the road soon, he would have to turn back. He swept his arms through the whiteout, moving laterally, sweeping a wide arc. His boot struck something solid. It wasn't wood or iron. It was soft. Josiah dropped to his knees, digging frantically through the snowdrift. His heavy mittens brushed against rough wool. He cleared the snow away to reveal a man curled into a tight fetal position, entirely buried under the drift. Josiah hauled the man up by his lapels. It was Emmett Dawson, a local farmer. Emmett's eyes were open, but glassy, his skin the color of old marble. He was largely unresponsive, deep in the final lethal stages of hypothermia. "Emmett," Josiah roared, slapping the man's frozen face. "Where's your wagon? Where's Rebecca?" Emmett merely blinked slowly, his mouth moving silently. Josiah stood up and looked around. The visibility was less than 2 feet. He began kicking through the snow in an expanding circle. 10 feet away, he found an overturned wagon, blown completely off the trail by the wind. Wedged underneath the wooden bed, sheltered from the worst of the wind but still freezing to death, was Rebecca Sterling Emmett's wife, clutching a dead frozen lantern. Josiah didn't waste time trying to wake them fully. He hauled Emmett to his feet, draping one of the man's arms over his broad shoulders. He grabbed Rebecca by the back of her heavy coat with his free hand. "Walk!" Josiah screamed into their ears. "Move your legs or you die here." Driven by Josiah's sheer terrifying willpower, the half-dead couple stumbled forward. It took 40 agonizing minutes to drag them back along the lifeline to the sod fortress. When Wyatt unbolted the door, Josiah practically threw the couple inside. He didn't stay. He drank a cup of scalding coffee, grabbed more rope, and went back out. Over the next 4 hours, Josiah Harding became a phantom of the prairie. He pushed out in every direction, extending his spiderweb of ropes. He found the stranded stagecoach half a mile north, its horses frozen solid in their harnesses. He dragged the driver and 3 passengers, a traveling salesman and 2 cattlemen, back to the bunker. He found 2 teenage farmhands lost mere yards from their own barn, wandering in blind circles. And just as the darkness of the afternoon transitioned into the literal blackness of night, Josiah found him. Josiah was walking the southern perimeter rope when he heard a faint, desperate sound over the wind. It wasn't a human voice. It was the sound of someone frantically beating a piece of wood against a metal bucket. Josiah unclipped from the main line, tying a short tether to the post, and waded into a massive drift. He found a man huddled inside the hollowed-out carcass of a dead horse. The man had cut the animal open to escape the wind, a desperate, grisly survival tactic. Josiah pulled the man out by his boots. As the snow cleared from the man's face, Josiah stopped. It was Thaddeus Boone, the wealthy man who had mocked Josiah's sod house. Thaddeus was missing a glove. His right hand was completely white, frozen solid, like a block of porcelain. His expensive imported coat was torn and packed with ice. Thaddeus looked up at Josiah, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Harding," he gasped, his voice a pathetic wheeze. "My boy, Jeremiah." "He's in the grave, Boone," Josiah said coldly, hauling the man over his shoulder like a sack of grain. "Where you're going?" By 8 p.m., the subterranean dirt fortress, originally built for 1 paranoid man and a dog, held 68 people. The physical space was a nightmare. The bunker was 20 feet by 15 feet. There was barely room to stand, let alone sit. People were packed shoulder to shoulder, huddled against the thick dirt walls, sitting on the heavy table crammed under the bed. The smell was overpowering, a thick, choking miasma of unwashed bodies, wet wool, melting ice-fear sweat, and the acrid stench of coal smoke. But it was warm. It was alive. In the center of the room near the stove, a makeshift triage center had been established. Eleanor Whitman and Rebecca Sterling, who had recovered enough to help, were working frantically. The biggest crisis was Thaddeus Boone. Josiah laid the wealthy homesteader on his own bed. Thaddeus was drifting in and out of consciousness. His right hand was the immediate danger. It was severely frostbitten, the tissue dead and solid. If it thawed too quickly in the heat of the bunker, the shock would destroy the blood vessels, leading to rapid gangrene and inevitably amputation or death. "We need snow," Josiah commanded, looking at Wyatt. "Buckets of it, now." "Snow," Thaddeus moaned, trying to pull his arm away. "No, warm it, please." "You warm it by the fire, you lose the hand, Boone," Josiah stated grimly. He grabbed a handful of snow from a bucket Wyatt had brought in from the threshold. "This is going to hurt worse than the freezing." Josiah began to aggressively pack the frozen limb in the snow, rubbing the dead flesh to slowly, agonizingly draw the frost out without cooking the dormant cells. Thaddeus screamed a ragged, horrifying sound that echoed off the low dirt ceiling, terrifying the children huddled in the corners. Jeremiah Boone pushed through the crowd, weeping, burying his face in his father's coat. As Josiah worked, a new silent killer began to creep into the fortress. With 68 sets of lungs breathing rapidly and a massive coal stove burning oxygen to keep the temperature up, the air in the sealed dirt box was rapidly becoming toxic. The thick sod walls and the heavy oak door, designed to keep the wind out perfectly, were also keeping the carbon dioxide in. Eleanor was the first to notice. She stood up to fetch more water and suddenly swayed, her vision tunneling. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, gasping for air that felt thin and useless. "Mr. Harding," she rasped, a wave of dizziness washing over her. "The candles." Josiah looked up. The 3 tallow candles he had lit on the table were sputtering. The flames were shrinking, turning a sickly blue before popping out entirely. The oxygen was failing. Panic rippled through the cramped room. A cattleman near the back coughed violently, clawing at his collar. "I can't breathe," he shouted, his voice thick with panic. "We're suffocating in this dirt hole." "Quiet!" Josiah roared, standing up so fast he knocked his chair over. His massive presence instantly silenced the room. He knew the danger. It was a brutal paradox. If he kept the door sealed, they would all quietly asphyxiate within the hour. If he opened the door, the ambient temperature of -30 degrees combined with the wind chill would flood the room, instantly dropping the temperature and freezing them to death. He had to thread the needle. "Wyatt Harrison, get over here," Josiah ordered, calling the 2 biggest boys. He moved to the heavy oak door. "We are going to crack it," Josiah explained, his hands on the heavy iron bolt. "Just an inch, just enough to vent the smoke and pull in fresh air. The wind is going to try to rip this door out of our hands and blow it wide open. If it does, the cold will kill everyone in this room before we can get it shut again. You do not let it open more than an inch." "Understood." The boys nodded, bracing their shoulders against the heavy wood, their boots digging into the dirt floor. Josiah gripped the handle. He took a deep breath of the stale, choking air and slid the bolt back. The moment the seal broke, the storm attacked. The wind hit the door with the force of a battering ram. The wood groaned violently. Josiah, Wyatt, and Harrison strained with every ounce of their strength muscles, screaming, pressing back against the unimaginable pressure of the cyclone outside. They held it to a 1-inch crack. Instantly, a blade of pure freezing air sliced into the room. It was so cold, it burned the lungs, instantly dropping the temperature near the door by 40 degrees. But with it came life. The fresh, highly oxygenated air swept through the stifling bunker. The remaining candle flared back to life, burning bright yellow. "Hold it!" Josiah grunted, his boots slipping slightly in the mud. "Hold it for 1 minute." For 60 agonizing seconds, the 3 of them wrestled with the storm, standing on the threshold between suffocation and freezing. The children shrieked as the freezing air hit them, pulling their blankets tighter. "Close it!" Josiah finally commanded. With a unified, desperate heave, they shoved the door forward, fighting the wind until the iron bolt slammed home. Josiah collapsed against the wall chest, heaving, sweat pouring down his face despite the freezing draft. The air in the room was cold now, dropping from 70 degrees to perhaps 40, but it was breathable. They were alive. But as Josiah looked at his watch, dread settled back over him. It was 10 p.m. on Thursday. The storm showed absolutely no signs of breaking. The barometer was still pinned to the bottom. They had survived the day, but the long, dark night of the Schoolhouse blizzard had only just begun, and the coal pile was getting smaller. By midnight on Thursday, the subterranean sod fortress had become an exercise in psychological endurance. The physical space was a nightmare of compressed humanity. 70 souls, including a family of 8 Josiah, had dragged from a stranded wagon 2 miles west, and a half-dozen railroad workers, caught surveying the northern ridge, were packed into 300 square feet of dirt. The air was heavy, smelling of wet wool fear, sweat, and the metallic tang of coal smoke. To conserve the rapidly dwindling oxygen and the precious Pennsylvania coal, Josiah had ordered the fire banked low. The temperature inside the bunker hovered just above freezing. It was enough to keep the blood flowing, but not enough to stop the uncontrollable collective shivering that vibrated through the floorboards. In the darkest corners, the younger children whimpered, their voices raw from crying. Eleanor Whitman, her own lips pale and her hands trembling, sat cross-legged in the dirt, a cluster of 5 first-graders huddled in her lap beneath a massive buffalo hide. She spoke to them in a low, raspy whisper, telling stories of warm summer days in Boston, of sailboats and hot apple cider. She spoke not because they were listening, but because the sound of a human voice was the only thing keeping the encroaching madness of the dark at bay. But the storm outside was not content to merely freeze them, it wanted to crush them. Around 2 a.m., a new sound cut through the relentless, deafening roar of the wind. It was a sharp, percussive crack, like a rifle shot echoing in a canyon. Josiah, who had been sitting by the stove with his eyes closed, snapped awake. He looked straight up. The ceiling of the bunker, constructed of heavy cedar poles layered with packed clay and a foot of living sod, was groaning. Dust and small clods of dry earth began to rain down on the huddled masses below. "What was that?" Wyatt Jensen whispered, his eyes wide with terror in the dim, flickering light of the stove's embers. Josiah didn't answer. He stood up, navigating the sea of legs and bodies with practiced care, and ran his bare hand along the central cedar beam that spanned the width of the room. It was bowing. The blizzard was not just blowing snow, it was packing it. The wind was driving the pulverized ice into drifts as hard as concrete. Josiah realized with a sickening jolt that his bunker, situated on a slight rise, was acting as a snow fence. A massive drift was accumulating directly on top of his flat roof. Thousands of pounds of dead weight were pressing down on the cedar poles, and the frozen earth was losing its structural integrity. Another loud crack echoed. A secondary support beam splintered slightly, dropping a cascade of dirt onto the railroad workers huddled beneath it. Panic flared instantly. People scrambled, pushing against each other, desperate to get away from the center of the room, but there was nowhere to go. They were pressed against the earthen walls, trapped in a shrinking box. "Nobody move!" Josiah bellowed, his voice overpowering the wind. "Stay exactly where you are." He turned to the thick, solid oak table occupying the center of the room. It was an antique, heavy and overbuilt, brought all the way from Ohio. "Wyatt Harrison, get over here," Josiah commanded. "We have to brace the central beam. If that beam snaps, the roof comes down, and we are all buried alive." The 2 teenage boys pushed through the crowd. Josiah grabbed his heavy iron fire poker and wedged it under the tabletop, using it as a crude lever to pop the wooden pegs holding the massive table together. They worked with frantic, desperate energy. Within minutes, they had dismantled the table, leaving them with 4 thick turned oak legs and a solid slab of hardwood. "Lift it," Josiah grunted, hoisting the heavy oak slab vertically. It was a terrifying, precarious operation. They had to stand the heavy oak slab upright, balancing it directly under the deepest part of the bow in the ceiling. Then Josiah used the thick table legs, wedging them beneath the slab and hammering them into the packed dirt floor with the flat side of his axe head to create a crude, desperate column of support. With every strike of the axe, the roof shuddered, threatening to give way completely. The children screamed. Thaddeus Boone, delirious from the agonizing pain of his thawing, frost-bitten hand, moaned in the corner. Finally, with a sickening groan of settling wood, the oak slab wedged tightly against the cedar ceiling beam. The bowing stopped. The makeshift pillar held. Josiah slumped against the wall, his chest heaving, sweat freezing to his brow. He looked at the makeshift column. It was a temporary fix, holding back an ocean of snow. But it had to be enough. Yet even as they secured the roof, the quiet, insidious reality of the prairie exacted its toll. In the far corner near the reinforced door, Rebecca Sterling let out a low, ragged sob. Josiah pushed his way through the crowd. Emmett Dawson, the farmer. Josiah had dragged from beneath the overturned wagon, lay perfectly still. His breathing, which had been a shallow, rattling wheeze for the past 6 hours, had stopped entirely. Despite the shelter, despite the shared body heat, The initial exposure had been too severe. The cold had crept too deep into his core, slowly shutting down his organs one by one. Rebecca clung to her husband's lifeless body, rocking back and forth in the dirt, her tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. Josiah knelt beside her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. There was no room for them in the grave. He simply placed a heavy calloused hand on her trembling shoulder and squeezed once. He then pulled a rough canvas tarp over Emmett's face. Death had joined them in the bunker, a grim reminder of the razor-thin line they were walking. Josiah looked at his pocket watch. It was 4 a.m. on Friday. They had to survive another day, and the coal bin was nearly empty. Friday brought no dawn to the subterranean fortress. Without windows, the only measure of time was the steady mechanical ticking of Josiah's watch and the agonizingly slow depletion of their resources. By Friday afternoon, the roar of the blizzard outside remained unbroken, a continuous maddening shriek that felt as though it was vibrating in the marrow of their bones. But inside, a new desperate crisis had overtaken the fear of the cold. Thirst. 70 people crammed into a small sealed space, lost moisture with every exhalation. Dehydration set in, rapidly bringing with it splitting headaches and cracked, bleeding lips. Little Lucy O'Donnell was crying softly, her throat too dry to produce actual tears, her small hands clutching her empty stomach. "Mr. Harding," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "The children need water. We all do." Josiah nodded grimly. He had 2 large tin buckets, but they were empty. The only source of water was the infinite ocean of frozen death outside the door. "We cracked the door again," Josiah announced to the older men. "Just enough to scrape snow from the drift. Same as before. Do not let the wind take the door." It took the combined strength of 4 men to inch the heavy oak door open against the crushing pressure of the snowpack and the gale. When they managed a 2-inch gap, a solid wall of packed crystalline ice greeted them. The snow had drifted so high against the bunker that it completely sealed the entrance. They used metal cups to aggressively scrape chunks of the hard-packed snow, filling the tin buckets before slamming the door shut and bolting it. But melting the snow presented a terrifying mathematical problem. To melt snow, you need heat. And by 6 p.m. on Friday, Josiah threw the last lump of Pennsylvania coal into the iron stove. As the black rocks turned to glowing ash, the temperature in the room immediately began to plummet. The cold, which had been held at bay by the thick sod walls, began to seep through the earth, radiating inward like a physical presence. "We need fuel." Josiah stated, his voice flat. He didn't ask for permission. Survival was a dictatorship. He walked over to his heavy wooden bed frame, where Thaddeus Boone lay shivering in a fever dream. "Get him up," Josiah ordered the railroad workers. They dragged the wealthy homesteader onto the dirt floor. Josiah took his axe and methodically smashed the sturdy pine bed frame into splinters. He fed the wood into the stove. It flared bright and hot, quickly melting the snow in the tin pot. The resulting water tasted foul, a mixture of coal dust dirt and the metallic tang of the tin, but to the survivors, it was nectar. They passed the pot around. Each person allowed only 2 small swallows. It was barely enough to wet their throats, but it kept them alive. When the bed frame burned away, Josiah axed the remaining wooden chairs. When those were gone, he dismantled the interior wooden shelving he had built to hold his preserves. He burned the heavy wooden handles of his shovels, his extra pickaxe, and finally the wooden floorboards from the small elevated platform he had built for his stove. They spent Friday night in near-total darkness, illuminated only by the dying red embers of Josiah's destroyed life. The psychological toll peaked during those black hours. The air was stale and thin. The children were exhausted beyond measure, falling into deep, unresponsive sleeps that terrified the adults who had to constantly shake them awake to ensure they hadn't frozen. Jeremiah Boone sat clutching his father's good hand, weeping silently as Thaddeus muttered incoherently, his frost-bitten arms swollen and blackening at the fingertips. Josiah sat by the stove, his back against the dirt wall. He watched the embers. He thought of his wife, Emmeline. He had built this tomb to ensure the wind would never take anything from him again. He looked at the 69 other chests rising and falling in the darkness. He had saved them, yes, but if the storm didn't break by morning, they would all freeze in the dark together. Then, at 7 a.m. on Saturday, the January 14th, the impossible happened. Josiah jerked awake. Something was horribly wrong. He felt a profound, unsettling absence. He pressed his hand against the sod wall. The heavy, rhythmic vibration that had shaken the dirt for nearly 48 hours was gone. He strained his ears. The guttural, train-like roar of the wind had ceased. "Listen," Josiah whispered. Eleanor Whitman raised her head. The children stirred. The railroad men looked at each other. Absolute, ringing silence. The white monster had finally moved on. "It's over!" Wyatt breathed, tears welling in his eyes. A ragged cheer attempted to rise from the exhausted crowd, but Josiah cut it off. "It's not over until we see the sky," he grunted, pushing himself up on stiff, aching legs. He unbolted the heavy oak door and pulled. It didn't move a fraction of an inch. The men crowded around it. 5 of them grabbed the heavy iron handle and pulled with all their remaining strength. The wood groaned, but the door remained sealed shut. "The drift," Josiah said, wiping sweat from his grimy forehead. The wind packed the snow against the door. It's like concrete, and the door opens outward. They were sealed in their own salvation. Panic, swift and blinding, threatened to overtake the room. They had survived the deadliest blizzard in history, only to be buried alive. Josiah didn't panic. He walked to his tool chest, grabbed a heavy iron pry bar and a hammer. "We take the door off its hinges," he announced. "We pull it inward, then we dig." It took an hour of agonizing labor to chisel the heavy iron pins out of the hinges. When the final pin dropped, the men carefully wrestled the massive oak slab backward, letting it fall onto the dirt floor. Where the door had been, there was now a solid wall of dense blue-white ice. Josiah took his one remaining short-handled shovel. He stepped up to the ice wall and began to hack. It wasn't digging, it was mining. The snow was packed so tightly by the cyclonic winds that it sparked against the iron shovel blade. He dug a tunnel straight ahead for 3 feet, passing the chunks of hard ice back to the men behind him who stacked it inside the bunker. Then, realizing the drift was too massive to dig through laterally, Josiah angled his tunnel upward. For 2 hours they took turns. Hack scraped past the ice back. Their muscles screamed their breath, freezing in the confined tunnel. Finally, as Josiah swung the shovel upward for the 1,000th time, the blade broke through. A blinding, agonizingly bright shaft of pure sunlight pierced the darkness of the tunnel. It hit the dirt floor of the bunker like a physical weight. The children gasped, shielding their eyes. Josiah used his bare, bleeding hands to widen the hole. He pulled himself up through the narrow vertical shaft, his shoulders scraping against the ice. He broke the surface and dragged himself out of the earth. He stood up, blinking against the brilliance. He was standing on top of a snowdrift that was 10 feet high, stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky above him was a piercing, cloudless, violently beautiful blue. The temperature was still 20 degrees below zero, and the air was so perfectly still, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Josiah looked down into the dark hole. "Come on up," he called out, his voice cracking. "Welcome back to the world." One by one, they emerged from the grave. The children came first, hoisted up through the tunnel by the men below, and pulled onto the surface by Josiah. They blinked against the blinding sun, their faces streaked with soot sweat, and dirt looking like tiny miners emerging from a deep shaft. They stood on the massive hardened snowdrifts, staring in awestruck silence at the alien landscape that had replaced their home. The Dakota prairie had been transformed into an endless rolling ocean of white dunes. The geography of the valley was completely erased. Familiar landmarks, fences, wagons, small hills were buried under 10 to 15 feet of densely packed snow. The sunlight, reflecting off the crystalline surface, was so intense it caused instant snow blindness if they stared too long. When Eleanor Whitman pulled herself from the hole, she immediately looked south toward where the schoolhouse should have been. She let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth. There was nothing there. The wind had not merely damaged the schoolhouse, it had eradicated it. The flimsy pine structure had been blown completely off its foundation and pulverized across miles of prairie. Only the cast-iron water pump and a few jagged floorboards poking through the snow marked where 34 children would have certainly frozen to death. "Dear God," Eleanor whispered, falling to her knees in the snow, pulling young Lucy O'Donnell tight against her chest. Thaddeus Boone was hoisted up next. The wealthy man was a shadow of his former arrogant self. His expensive coat was ruined, his face was gaunt, and his right arm was wrapped in bloody makeshift bandages from a torn shirt. He looked toward his own property. His magnificent two-story clapboard house, the pride of the valley, was devastated. The wind had sheared the entire second floor off, leaving the bottom half packed to the ceiling with snow. Thaddeus collapsed onto the hard-packed drift, his unwounded hand clutching his son Jeremiah. He looked back at the small, ugly hole in the snow, the entrance to the dirt fortress he had so mercilessly mocked. Then he looked at Josiah Harding. Josiah stood slightly apart from the group, staring out at the frozen horizon, his face an unreadable mask of dirt and exhaustion. Thaddeus crawled across the snow toward Josiah. When he reached the massive man, the wealthy homesteader didn't speak. He simply reached out with his good left hand and gripped the hem of Josiah's heavy, battered buffalo coat. He bowed his head into the snow and wept loud, racking sobs of absolute humiliation and profound, life-altering gratitude. Josiah looked down at Thaddeus. He didn't smile, and he didn't offer a gentle word. He simply reached down, grabbed Thaddeus by the collar, and hauled him to his feet. "Keep your tears, Boone." Josiah rasped, his voice raw. "You're going to need the water. We have a long walk to town." It would be 3 days before rescue parties from the neighboring settlements managed to dig their way into the valley. They arrived with sledges and heavy draft horses, expecting a grim, horrifying task. The entire territory was in mourning. The suddenness and sheer ferocity of the Schoolhouse blizzard had caught thousands unawares. Across the Dakota and Nebraska territories, the death toll was staggering. 235 people perished, many of them children caught in inadequate schools, or farmers who had lost their way mere yards from their own doors. The stories filtering in were of unspeakable tragedy. Fathers found frozen, huddled over their sons' teachers who had tied their students together only to perish as a group in the open. The rescue party approached the remains of the Valley Schoolhouse with heavy hearts, carrying 35 small canvas shrouds. Instead of frozen bodies, they found deep tracks in the snow leading away from the foundation, marching directly toward the rise in the center of the valley. When the rescuers finally reached the sod fortress, they found 70 people alive, battered, frostbitten, starving, and traumatized but breathing. It was the largest single group of survivors in the entire history of the storm. The aftermath of the blizzard changed the valley forever. Thaddeus Boone lost 3 fingers on his right hand to gangrene, but he survived. He never rebuilt his grand clapboard house. Instead, he built a stout single-story home with walls 2 feet thick, and he never spoke an ill word against a neighbor again. He offered Josiah $1,000, a vast fortune at the time, as a reward for saving his son. Josiah refused it. "I didn't dig it for you," Josiah had told Thaddeus gruffly, standing in the mud of the spring thaw. "I dug it for the wind. The wind just happened to be angrier than usual." Josiah Harding did not become a boisterous town hero. He remained a quiet, solitary man who kept to himself, tending his land and watching the horizon. But he was no longer viewed as the madman of the prairie. The mockery ceased entirely. When he walked into the mercantile to buy supplies, men took off their hats. When the children he had saved saw him on the road, they did not run. They waved, recognizing the hulking figure as the immovable object that had shielded them from the unstoppable force. The sod house stood for another 40 years, outlasting the wooden structures that rose and fell around it. It remained an ugly, squat, windowless lump of earth. But to the people of the valley, and to the generations of descendants who would live because of what happened on January 12, 1888, it was never again called Harding's grave. It was known simply as the Fortress, and it stood as a monument to the harsh truth of the frontier. When the sky turns to a liar and the world attempts to erase you, sometimes the only way to survive is to bury yourself in the earth, hold the line, and refuse to let the wind win. Thank you so much for reading this incredible true tale of survival against the deadliest blizzard in American history. If Josiah's grit and the harrowing survival of those 70 souls inside the earthen fortress kept you hooked, please smash that like button to support the channel. Share this story with your friends, family, and anyone who loves a gripping historical thriller. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our deep dives into the most intense survival stories history has to offer. Leave a comment below. How would you have handled the claustrophobia and the cold inside the sod bunker? Stay safe, stay prepared, and we'll see you in the next video.